Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you're all well and feeling safe wherever you are around the world. My name is Joanna Dunlop. I'm Irish and I'm speaking to you from my home outside Paris in France, which is still a COVID red zone. I serve on the SPE International Board of Directors as the Technical Director for HSE and Sustainability. It's my honor to introduce today's Gaia Talk, an SPE live stream and our first public Gaia event. So let me give you some brief background. We founded Gaia nearly a year ago in collaboration with IPECA, IOGP, OGCI, and our sister society, the AAPG. Its basic premise is to help ensure oil and gas is coming right out on the right side of history, valued for its contributions, yet agile and imaginative enough to evolve with changing expectations of its role in society, demanding as those expectations might appear to be. At our first Gaia Summit last year, 55 of us co-created a blueprint of 6 pathways and 4 principles. And today's Gaia Talk applies all 4 of our principles and advances along one of those pathways, measuring what matters. We've had 20 plus years of measuring sustainability performance factors, largely driven by the needs of investors and activist stakeholders. Some flagship measurement initiatives have emerged, but all would acknowledge that there's still a long way to go before businesses themselves are integrating and maturing the metrics needed by operations, R&D, and commercial roles to drive the insights and the decisions that affect their sustainability performance. Gaia is an ambitious program, but as the great anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. We are a fast-growing, non-hierarchical, multi-stakeholder community with names and faces and voices, a community that wants to change the world for the better, and with oil and gas playing a key role in how we make the world a better place. Today, we've convened a few of these thoughtful, committed citizens to help us accelerate our progress towards these ambitious goals. First, Pavan Sukhdev. Pavan is one of the most influential sustainability thought leaders and innovators, particularly in the field of sustainability metrics. He's the founder and CEO of The Gist Advisory, a startup making the integrated P&L a reality for businesses. Pavan is also the president of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, the leading and highly regarded nature conservation NGO. Our second panelist will be Antoine Halve, the chief analyst and founding partner of another very exciting startup, Kairos, a technology-focused Earth observation analytics firm using unconventional data to bring insights to industry. Antoine is also a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy and was formerly the chief oil analyst to the IEA. Our third speaker will be Poppy Kalezi, one of the architects of the Gaia program and global energy director for the Environmental Defense Fund, another highly regarded NGO. Poppy is Stavanger-based and leads EDF's energy program in Europe with a focus on delivering ambitious EU policies that will contribute to deep reductions in global oil and gas methane emissions by 2025. Our final speaker will be Vanessa Miller-Felts, Director of Energy Innovation and Impact with Microsoft, based out of Washington, DC, and originally from Paris and Pondicherry in India. Vanessa has a background in green infrastructure private equity and also worked with the French Ministry of Finance. Last, but very much not least, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Tatiana Mitrova, your moderator for today's Gaia Talk. She's the director of the Energy Center at Skolkovo Business School in Moscow, from where she joins us this evening. She's also a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, a scientific advisor to the Energy Research Institute at the Russian Academy of Sciences, a visiting fellow to the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and a distinguished research fellow at the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan. Tatiana is a non-executive director on the boards of the Schlumberger and the Novatec corporations. I wasn't joking when I said we were lining up a dream team. To you, our audience, be part of our discussion. Please engage with us. Please ask the questions that you want to ask of our experts. Use the chat boxes on the live streams to direct your questions and we'll feed them to the panel. Thank you. And so with great pride, I now hand over the reins to Tatiana to lead today's Gaia Talk. Thank you, Tatiana.
Thank you, Johanna. Hello, everybody, and greetings from Moscow. I'm Tatiana Mitrova, and it's really my great pleasure to welcome our distinguished guests today. So Johanna has named them already. Pavan Sukhdev, President WWF and CEO of the GIST Advisory, who is going to prove to us that nature has actually issue invoices and we can calculate them for her. Antoine Huff, co-founder of Kairos and senior scholar, Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy, who is going to show us what a powerful role advanced technology can play in serving the oil and gas industry's ability to manage its own methane emissions. Poppy Kalezi, Global Energy Director of the Environmental Defense Fund on the eve of the EU Green Deal, is going to talk to us about how important transparency and auditing are to establish the right conditions for business to integrate particular sustainability factors. And Vanessa Miller-Fels, Director of Energy Innovation and Impact at Microsoft, will give us a sense of how digitalization and artificial intelligence can benefit man's understanding of the nature. We all definitely agree that our industry should become sustainable. There is a big role for the governments to play, for example, with carbon pricing, but the responsibility of the industry itself is also huge. Our LIF panel today will address sustainability in the oil and gas industry using the lens of measuring what matters. Oil and gas industry is being held to account on its sustainability performance for quite some time. But the problem is that our current sustainability measurement efforts are largely carried out to satisfy external stakeholders, and even then, very imperfectly to the detriment of the public, policymakers, investors, and the industry itself. Some flagship initiatives have emerged, but all would acknowledge that there is still a long way to go before businesses themselves are proactively developing and maturing the metrics they need in order to improve their sustainability performance. You probably remember management guru Peter Drucker is often quoted as saying that you can't manage what you can't measure. Drucker meant that you can't know whether or not you are successful unless success is defined and tracked. It is 100% applicable to the oil and gas industry. We have enormous amount of data, we love data, and we know how to work with it. But what we do not know is which exactly metrics should we track to measure sustainability of our performance and how we are complying with the SDGs. We need some universal metrics which provide objectivity, which can be comparable, and most importantly, which are fit for decision. This panel today will look at how to measure and improve sustainability performance, its contribution to the Sustainability Development Goals, and in particular, how to engage the internal stakeholders, the business decision makers in business administration, in operations, R&D, and commercial roles, so that they and their business can better enable development that is truly sustainable. Our four panelists are working at the cutting edge and will show us some of the way there. But it is not only their job today. I am really happy to see such an international and diverse audience. I see here people from all over the world. And I would encourage each of you to participate actively. Please ask your questions and share your comments. Welcome all. Please do not remain just observers. Your opinion matters. So, without spending too much time on the introduction, let's move to our first speaker, Pavan Sukhdev, President at WWF and CEO at GIST Advisory. So, Pavan, what's wrong with the current ESG rating methodologies and how could they be improved?
Thank you, Tatiana, for your thoughtful introduction. And I was hoping to share some slides, and I'm going to make one last attempt just in case, but the share screen doesn't seem to work right now. No, it still doesn't, unfortunately. Never mind. I'll have to ask you to be imaginative as I describe charts and X and Y axes, but that's fine. We are all engineers. I'm an ex-physicist myself. Astrophysics was my line before I went into banking and finance. And I guess physicist by training, banker by profession, and an environmental economist by passion. And my work has been to demonstrate that the economics of nature matter. Just because something has a value but no price, it doesn't mean you can ignore it, either as a policymaker or as an administrator or as a businessman. Oh, wow, we seem to have slides. I can see something called Measuring What Matters for Corporate Sustainability. So this is GIST is my company, the one which I founded, as a means of responding in a commercial manner to the challenge of sustainability metrics. To me, as Peter Drucker says, you cannot manage what you do not measure. We are not measuring sustainability, right? Today, there's so much talk about corporate sustainability, and yet when you ask someone point blank, define corporate sustainability, I can tell you that it's really difficult to get an answer. So please ask me that question and I have an answer. To me, corporate sustainability is about measuring impacts in 4 dimensions. What are the 4 dimensions? They are the 4 capital dimensions. That is produced capital, financial capital. This is 2 sides of the same coin. You can buy manufactured goods and services. Don't go there yet. I just want to define sustainability before we move. And so corporate sustainability is you need to be positive plus on the axis of financial capital. You need to be positive on the axis of human capital, which is your employees' knowledge, skills, and health. So unless you can garner that, your employees are like a capital resource. In a sense, you have rented the employee, paying them a lease rental called salary and paying them maintenance called performance bonuses and so on. If they don't do well, you don't do well, right? If you want to do well in the marketplace, you begin with the workplace. So that is human capital. It's not yours, it's your employee's human capital. The third capital is natural capital. And whether it is dead natural capital like oil and gas reserves, or whether it is living natural capital, the ecosystem services that maintain us, all provide us food, fuel, fiber, and everything that we know as life, we have to maintain them. And if we run out of them, then we have a problem. And that's a public good. Then there's social capital, which is the relationships, both the official and the unofficial. Official as in constitution, law and order, police, judicial system, taxation system, and so on. Unofficial as in trust, respect, ability to live in communal harmony between Hindus and Muslims, for example. These are aspects of social capital. If you don't have social capital maintained in an economy, none of the other capitals can deliver the incomes which give them value. In economics, in finance, there's something called the capital asset pricing model. You can use that to price produced capital, human capital, natural capital, but you can't use that to value social capital because that's not a generator of income. But without social capital, it's the binding force, right? As an ex-physicist, I tell other physicists that think about it in terms of, quarks and gluons. You need the quarks, the 3 quarks, and then this is the gluon, basically. So think of it as particles. And then I tell them that, think of the 4 capitals as aspects that have to be plus, 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 and plus, right? You can't really net off human capital and natural capital saying, oh, well, I do so much good training and development of my people, so it's okay. I can do a bit of negative natural capital impacts. Not really. I mean, you may, but the point is, unless there's somebody else who's got the opposite situation, you will have a problem. If there's 1,000 of you, 100,000 of you, it may be fine. The Earth's a very big place. But if there's 1 million of companies which have got minus, 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 plus, or indeed minus, minus, plus, plus, the things on which you are minus, the 2 axes of natural capital and social capital, which is typically where companies do have negative impacts, we will end up having such a massive overweight on negative impacts that you will have a global systemic problem. And there are 2 of them which we are facing right now. One is called inequity and poverty, and there's a lot of that. And the other one is called climate change, and there's a lot of that as well. So we have ignored performance metrics because why? Not because we don't know about the fact that you have to measure performance in 4 dimensions and not just 1 dimension, but because there is no accounting for externalities. There is a shareholder profit and loss. IFRS requires you to report it. It's reported every year or every quarter if you're an American company. But there is no IFRS for reporting on human capital, natural capital, social capital. And that's the problem. These are the areas of externalities. The value of externalities is massive, right? We are talking about the private sector, which is in any case 2/3 of the economy and jobs. So it is 2/3 of impacts as well in terms of environmental impacts. We are not at present measuring the impacts of the private sector. And therefore we have uncharted, unrecorded externalities. And therefore we are not managing what needs to be measured. What needs to be measured needs to be managed. We are not measuring externalities, and therefore we are not managing them. And we are doing the exact opposite of the topic of this seminar, which is measuring what matters. Externalities, my friend, matters. In fact, the reason why we don't measure them goes back in history, and this is really hilarious. So today, governments use something called the general equilibrium model to measure their economies. And the whole idea is that demand interacts with supply, and that prices are set by demand and supply, and that the composition of prices will be such that it gradually moves in the direction where people are optimizing their individual utilities. And that's basically a model that was created by someone called Leon Walras at the turn of the last century in 1905. Ironically, the reason he turned economics, which was really a social science, into maths is because he was constantly seeking his father's attention. He was the younger brother. His elder brother was a physicist. So you can say that today's mathematical focus on economics has been born out of what I describe as physics envy by a mathematician called Leon Walras, who, by the way, applied for the École Polytechnique and he couldn't get in, and he went to the School of Mines and he didn't do that well as an engineer. But he created this mathematical model of the economy, which, because of its simplicity and its necessary simplicity, ignores externalities. And that's the genesis of our problem. We don't manage what we need to measure. Externalities, as a result of that, have become huge. We are talking about 11, 12, 14 trillion dollars of externalities in an economy which is $90 trillion. These are not small. And that's
Pavan,
yes.
May I jump in? So
Yes.
you are talking about accounting externalities, and for sure we are not doing it properly in the oil and gas sector, but in the other sectors. I mean, your huge experience, you are dealing with many sectors of the economy. Is anybody doing that?
No,
So are there any?
This is a systemic and global problem, right? So unfortunately, I think we'll see my slides in a moment. I want to show you something, how we can measure externalities. So today when we have ESG, I don't know if we have that ESG slide. Again, these are ESG, there are 600 different ESG rating methodologies. If you look at my slide deck, you'll find a comparison between how you measure ESG factors by one rating agency, which is MSCI's metric and one of their rating factors, and the other one is from FTSE. These are both respectable, but there's no correlation between them. So the net result is whatever you are doing on ESG is essentially qualitative. It's basically judgmental. It is, you are using environmental and social factors and you're rating them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're adding them up. You're adding up things which don't compare, right? Environmental, social factors are drivers, are impacts. Governance is a driver. You can't compare one with the other. Governance drives all of the other factors. So today's state of affairs is terrible, and time has come for us to start measuring impacts. And the beauty is that with science and with economics together, it can be done. When we, whether it's my company, when we measure, if you could go to skip the next slide, which is basically showing you that, the next slide shows you that lack of correlation that is happening, which is, by the way, any of the 600, if you compare, you'll get the same level of lack of correlation. So this is not, I'm not criticizing MSCI or Financial Times. They're all like that. Why? Because they're not measuring the impacts. We need to start measuring the impacts. You can't just keep adding up qualitative ratings and making them appear quantitative and then end up with lack of understanding of corporate sustainability, which is about being plus, 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 plus. It's about being positive on human, natural, social, and obviously produced capital. Otherwise, you don't survive as a company. On my next slide, I illustrate how we can actually do it, which is to measure capital impacts. Capital is an economic metaphor for value, and you can actually measure this and value it. You can measure environmental impacts, natural capital externalities. You can measure human capital externalities, social capital externalities, and even financial value addition, which is the missing bits, financial impacts beyond profits. They are there in the balance sheet and profit and loss of the company, but we don't report them simply because nobody asked us to report them. Companies are not required to report impacts on society. They're only required to report impacts on shareholders. And my next slide, I give you the example of how it can be done. And this is a simple case, simple as in everyone understands air pollution, right? Factories generate pollution. This is a cement factory, cement company, by the way, 15 factories somewhere in Asia. I can't give the name because it's confidential. It's a client. So the way that we do it is to measure the dispersion of pollution coming from the chimneys. So essentially the pollutants that are the most important ones are SOx, NOx, and PM2.5 and PM10 particles. And the diagram on the top right-hand side shows where the pollution lands. How do we do this? Because we use the NASA global database of wind speeds and wind direction. We basically do our dispersion modeling. Yes, indeed, for all the physicists, we draw the Gaussian curves and plan it out, literally location by location, pollutant by pollutant. That's how it is done. This is how the correct way of measuring impacts of air pollution are. But so you know where the pollution lands. That's the diagram on the top right-hand side. But the point is you need to know how many people are breathing that pollution. For that, you need a global population map, which is 1 square kilometer by 1 square kilometer. And then once you've calculated the impacts, in other words, the absorption by the receptors, the people, then you have to go to the WHO database, which tells you what is the likelihood of an increase in respiratory diseases and cardiovascular diseases as a result of those increases in SOx, NOx, PM2.5 and PM10. Disease by disease, there is a WHO database that does this. And then you go to the country level and you work out for that country concerned, what is the morbidity and the mortality cost, which means in economic terms, how much does it cost to cure these diseases if the statistical probability of them striking you happens, and how much is the loss of life cost in terms of the family will lose X number of years of productive life of the mother or the father or the sister or the brother. What is the cost to that family of not having the breadwinner bring in that income? So we calculate these things, and it's very sad to have to calculate to calculate the cost of losing lives, but there is a statistical probability of air pollution leading to human deaths. In fact, it's one of the biggest drivers of death around the planet, apart from smoking and so on. So this is how calculations are done. These are ways of estimating the capital costs, in other words, the human capital costs of an environmental impact. And in the same way, we can calculate using massive water scarcity data, which we've contained, which we pulled together. We can calculate the costs of water usage and then water pollution and so on and so forth. And human capital, the positive side, the value of training and development of the employee and what it means in terms of the present value of the future incomes that are increased as a result of this year's company training and development of its employees. That's positive.
Pavan, I have a question from the audience.
Yes, please.
What do you think if this evaluation methodology would be applied to the countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, or India? How that would change our understanding of the whole picture?
So I've got news for you. It is already being applied. The same logic that I have, the 4 capitals that I talked to you about, human, social, natural, and produce capital. The United Nations has a report which has been published 3 times, 2012, 2014, and 2018, right? It's called the Inclusive Wealth Report. It's already available, but the problem is this. The policymakers are not listening because all they are looking at is GDP, GDP, GDP. They're looking only at GDP growth. So unfortunately, the problem that I'm describing to you, which has got to be driven from the corporate sector, from the private sector, the same problem exists at the macro level as well. Macro performance is being mismeasured as well, not just micro level or private sector performance. And there is an inclusive wealth account for Malaysia. It's there in the report of 2018.
Pavan, and with all these new approaches and new metrics which are really needed, I was quite shocked by the first chart that you've shown on ESG methodology. I mean, it doesn't help at all.
No, it doesn't. Really doesn't. It really doesn't.
With the metrics that you are proposing, where do you think we are standing on our journey to comparability? Making data fit for decision in a competitive context. So, for example, we've seen several very ambitious and exciting net zero announcements from top operators. But investors seem to be quite skeptical, first of all, due to the lack of comparability between different companies. So how do you think we can overcome this skepticism?
Yeah, so I think with investors, my experience, and I have been speaking with them only, I speak mainly with corporations, right? But I have been speaking with investors for the last year now. I'm actually finding the opposite, that they are actually as frustrated as I am with these so-called ESG rating methodologies. And they are quite excited by what we have to offer. So now we are pulling, even though we began, and I'd like to share with you where already there is some success, which is that there is an interest from the International Chamber of Commerce. We launched a small version of our platform. Right now we are launching in World Environment Day, June 5th, GIST will be launching the major platform, which is for big companies. And by the way, we have 20 sectors there. And one of the sectors on which we have got the full benchmarks and so on is indeed the oil and gas sector. So I welcome you guys, those who are involved in this, to actually try it out, and you'll find some interesting results, and you'll find benchmarks. We have already done the calculation of benchmarks because we have the published results on GRI, CDP, balance sheet and profit and loss, sustainability reports of so many different oil and gas companies. And we have enough, we have done a scouring of the data using our cognitive search engines. So on 5th of June, you'll be able to measure, but already, and this was started in Davos this year when we announced, and that's my next slide, if you can go to my last slide or whatever. This shows the picture of John Denton, who's the head of the ICC, announcing our collaboration with them. Why is he interested? Because his interest is actually, that's him. His interest is to promote sustainability to the small and medium enterprises. And he and I have exactly the same passion in common, which is we keep talking about the SMEs. Nobody wants to do anything to help them. So we created a version of our system in advance of the main system. We created a version which was agreed with the International Chamber of Commerce, which is going to be offered to the small and medium enterprise for literally a tiny amount, literally like $250 or $400 or something like that. And the idea is to help them answer the basic questions about what are their impacts on the environment, greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, water usage, land use change, if there is any, or water and land pollution, waste, because they all have some waste. What are the impacts? How do they measure them? And how do they value them? And our system provides us the means to do that. So the launch has obviously been delayed by COVID. Sadly, COVID has delayed everything, including us. But it's going on now. So we have the 5 pilot countries of the International Chamber of Commerce. We actually have SMEs right now talking to our team in Singapore to do the first country pilot. But what is exciting me even more than this is the fact that, people like you are clearly aware that this is a problem. Nobody's measuring externalities properly. And the ESG rating methodologies, I mean, honestly, like I'm talking to scientists and engineers here, please, I mean, you will either laugh or cry when you see how they do things there. So I would say, yeah.
I have another question from the audience. So thank you guys for being engaged. Anna is writing that some industries do report regularly on impacts, social, environmental, human resources, economic, health, and safety. Actually, I believe mining is one of the best when it comes to calculating impacts, and IFC has quite stringent standards of calculation of impact. Not perfect, but quite detailed. What is the difference with your approach?
Yeah, so with IFC basically asks qualitative numbers and quantity, but none of these agencies that you are mentioning are measuring the impact. And impact is a change in human well-being, right? In other words, it's a change in one of the capitals. And you cannot talk about changes in capitals without assigning some economic value to them, because the word capital is an economic metaphor for value, right? So when IFC defines its criteria, and I like the fact that the IFC does that because it gives us the means to ask companies, look, guys, you are already reporting the amount of air pollution. You have given the quantities that you have emitted. You're already reporting the greenhouse gas, GHG, tons of CO2e, right? Why don't you just use our system to convert those quantities into economic values? Then you have a measure of materiality. Like, okay, so you have 5 kilograms of this gas and that gas. What does it mean? What is the meaning of 5 kilograms of SOx and NOx? Okay, when you work it out in terms of the air pollution impacts on human health, then it suddenly makes a difference. Then you understand what it means. It means this is the cost to human health. Here's how much is the cost, right? Or this is the cost to incomes. Here's how much is the cost. Or this is the benefit, for that matter, on the human capital side. You may be training and developing your employees and spending lots of money on lots of training. How much difference have you made? Do you know? No, because you have not calculated it, right? So we are saying, please use the platforms, use the new technology that is available now, do the calculations to measure the impacts. And you're right, because mining has been on the sort of, in the eye of the storm. Obviously, the mining companies have got good engineers and they have put in their efforts to calculate the values, to calculate the quantities, right? So where they ask for quantities, they provide the quantities, which is a good start. But my point is, you need to value those quantities. There's no point saying so I give you a beautiful example from which actually happened. A company which was another cement company was selected by an SRI investor on the logic that, well, these guys have 0.41 cubic meters per ton of cement water usage, whereas I'm told by my other environmental advisor that such and such big company in India is actually at 0.42. So it's fine, right? It should be okay. And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, I have to measure the impacts. He said, what do you mean? Then I explained what I meant. They said, oh, can you do it for us? I said, sure. As a sample, we'll do this for you. So when we did the calculation of their identified cement company versus the benchmark in India, it turned out that our water scarcity map showed that all the sites that they had picked up for this new company they were about to invest in was in water scarce areas. So even though they were 0.41 cubic meters compared to 0.42 in the benchmark, which is more or less the same, in fact, their impact was 4 times bigger compared to this other company because it was not in the water scarce areas in India. Nobody would know that until you calculated the impact of that water. That doesn't help to know that you are at 0.4 cubic meters per ton of cement. What you need to know is what's the cost to people of that 0.4 cubic meters, which you will never know unless you know whether it's in a water scarce area or in a water surplus area. And you will never know what that means unless you valued the impacts in economic terms. Materiality is about measuring impacts in economic terms. That's the difference between IFC and us.
I see, Pawan. Thank you so much. We will definitely come back to the issue of materiality and also to the issue of valuing this capital and probably commoditizing it. But meanwhile, I would suggest to move on. You gave a fantastic view from outside oil and gas industry. Now let's move inside the industry. And I'm happy to give the floor to my colleague, Antoine Huff, senior scholar at Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy, and also chief analyst and founding partner of Kairos, a technology-focused Earth observation analytics firm. Antoine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Thank you, Johanna, for the invitation to speak. I'm really excited and also humbled to share the stage with such great speakers and people who make such a big impact on the issues that we care about. The purpose of what we do at Kairos is very much in line with the objective of the Gaia network and very much in line with what... Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I've been, spending most of my professional life doing oil market analysis, energy market analysis, and one of the key challenges that the industry has faced has always been the lack of reliable, timely, comprehensive data. This is particularly true when it comes to the climate footprint of the industry. For a very long time, we've been relying on self-reporting by companies, and oftentimes self-reporting based on untested assumptions about from engineers about the climate intensity of various processes. We're now moving to a very different world where technology is mature, is available to measure the climate impact of the oil and gas industry in very concrete, precise, reliable, and timely ways. And this is, I think, a complete game changer. So maybe we can move on to, I think I have a few slides, and I think some of them may be. So if we move to the next one, our company, Kairos, has developed algorithms that extract information from existing satellites, specifically from Sentinel-5P from the European Space Agency, that provide very specific, reliable measurements on major emissions around the world. So this is good news and bad news. Let me start with the bad news. The bad news is that based on our measurements, there's a lot more methane emissions in the world than we suspected. There's a lot more fugitive methane emissions out there, major events, than were accounted for using engineered estimates based on assumptions about the carbon intensity of the energy industry. We've run measurements on a daily basis for the last couple of years, and looking at just last year, on average, we detected about 100 major emissions a day around the world. This is a rough map of where these measurements have been detected, where the detections have been made. They cover the entire map. They cover the oil and gas industry as well as other industries like the coal industry. This is mostly as far as the oil and gas industry upstream, a bit midstream. And of these 100 events a day, about 50%, about half, can be attributed to regions that are oil and gas producers and to the oil and gas industry. So the detections that we've measured are all above 10 hours of methane an hour, and that translates roughly into 20 megatons of methane a year, or 1.8 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent a year, of which about half can be traced to the oil and gas industry. The map is still a work in progress. The technology is mature. The application of the technology and the translation of the technology into detailed measurements case by case is still a work in progress. There's still areas of the map that we don't cover as comprehensively as the others. And there's some areas where there are some false positives that we are stripping out, we're eliminating, filtering out from our assessment. But the assessments, generally speaking, is quite remarkable. It's bad news because it means the footprint of the industry is much larger than anybody suspected. It's good news because this opens the door for fixing the problem, for remediation, and for improvements. And it's doing it in three ways. It's really allowing industry to improve its operations and reduce its footprint. It's enabling policymakers to design policies that really move the needle, that have an impact. And it's enabling the allocation of investment to where it matters, to where it has an impact on the carbon footprint. It's enabling investors to reconcile the goal for energy and the goal for climate stewardship. So let me take a couple of examples on the next slide. Here we have a look, if we can see the next slide, I'm not sure. We tracked detection in Algeria, in the Saharan desert, in January of this year. We detected 3 major emissions in early January at 3 different locations in Algeria. And here we have a picture of one of these detections that we've measured using a dispersion model to about 80 tons per hour. And we've also designed the algorithms and the technology to trace this event to its source. On the next slide, we've identified where the source is, and we've identified in that area a number of wells and facilities that could potentially have been leaking. The next stage in our determination process has been to try to select among these wells, among these potential sources of the leak, the one specific area that was most likely responsible for the event. And on the next slide, we've done so by combining different technologies, combining readings from Sentinel-5P to readings from other satellites, shortwave, infrared readings from Sentinel-2. And we've basically identified in this case a well that emitted methane, that vented methane for about 8 days in January, from January 1st to January 8th, and then stopped emitting methane, stopped venting, but went into flaring. And here, just when the detection of the vented methane stopped on Sentinel-5P, we started to pick up signs of methane flaring from the same location, from one particular location that we then identified as being the one source. So this is a significant event. This was about 80 tons of methane an hour, so a major source of emission equivalent to several large coal-fired power plants. There's many other cases that we've looked into. On the next slide, I have a very brief summary of some of them, including an event in the Permian Basin in December of last year that we've traced to a particular source using a different mix of technologies. We've identified events in Turkmenistan, no surprise there, I guess, in the Shatlik gas field. In Russia, we've picked up major emissions in September 2019 from areas along the Yamal pipeline, and we've identified particularly a natural gas compressor station that was responsible for large emissions of about 20 tons per hour. In Australia, we've picked up emissions from a coal mine. So I'm happy to go into more detail into the various technologies, the various methodologies that we've applied to these particular cases. But the key message I want to focus on, and I want to keep my remarks very brief, is really that the technologies today are game changer. And this is a work in progress. We're not the only ones developing new technologies. Others in the field are developing new instruments, launching new satellites that will advance, I think, our visibility on the industry tremendously. But already today, using existing technology, existing satellites, we can really help the industry improve its operations. We can help policymakers design the right policies. We can help the investment community develop more robust ESG methodologies, and very much in like with what Pavan was saying. We can really improve the E component of the ESG standards and come up with very, very reliable, very robust measurements of methane. So I think this is really important, and the three particularly key characteristics of these technologies are threefold. Independence. It's very important for industry to not simply report its own emissions, but rely on independent third-party measurements. Nobody can trust any particular oil and gas company in what they disclose about the measurements. It's very good to measure, and a lot of companies have announced goals to disclose their methane footprint, their carbon footprint, and to come clean and lift the kimono on their operations. But nobody will trust necessarily what company X or Y or Z is saying about their own measurements because of lessons learned from the Volkswagen scandal, for example, Dieselgate, or other incidents. It's very important to be comprehensive, and the satellite detection is particularly useful because it's global. It's not just detected to areas that are already suspected of being a source of emissions. It spans the entire world and looks for emissions where we don't necessarily expect them. We've picked up, for example, large emissions in Bangladesh, not a big producer of oil and gas, not a big consumer of oil and gas, but a large source of emissions from leaking pipelines that are really either out of shape, out of maintenance, or that have been used for pilfering by the population. And finally, it's real time. So it really enables quick action, quick remediation. Whenever an incident is detected, it opens the door for quick corrective measures and mitigation. So the technology today is here, is mature, is constantly improving, but is already enabling the industry to reconcile the goal of responsible climate stewardship and energy development, and producing the energy that we need to sustain economic growth and to provide energy access to those that still need energy.
Thank you, Antoine. This is extremely interesting, and I've got already many questions to you. So first of all, you've mentioned that indeed the technology is mature, but how to define which exactly metrics should be measured? Are we measuring too many indicators without maturing them first? So what do you think about that?
I think we have to measure what has the biggest impact. So right now we're focusing on the very large emissions of methane, but we can fine-tune these measurements, and we're also tracking carbon emissions at a much more granular level in many different ways. But I think it's key to focus on the low-hanging fruits. And carbon emissions, major emissions, super emissions from the oil and gas industry are a very large contributor to GHG emissions and to global warming. It's key, in my view, to focus on what has a big impact. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, 84 times as potent as the carbon dioxide for the first 20 years. Fixing methane now is very critical. It's going to buy us carbon space to fix the other problems in due course. But it's very important to focus first on what has the biggest impact, what really moves the needle, what addresses the issue at hand, and what can help us avert a major catastrophic crisis as the planet keeps warming. So I would say the key thing is scale and is impact, and what can really be used to make a difference in climate, and also in enabling investment in an industry that's increasingly under a cloud of suspicion. Measuring methane, measuring carbon can really help distinguish between good actors and bad actors, between actors that we can invest in, actors that should be fixing their operations before they become worthy of investment. It also enables policymakers to put a price on carbon appropriately and to design policy tools that can really have an impact. The European Commission today is trying to come up with a way to price carbon and to put a penalty on sources of imported energy that come with a high footprint and reward sources that come with a low footprint. Measuring the kind of measurements that we can provide can really advance this objective. And actually, our approach has been embraced by the European Commission recently in a workshop on the strategies to mitigate climate change. The whole approach of using existing technologies and being comprehensive and real time has been fully endorsed, and I think that's very encouraging and very justified.
Antoine, I have a question from the audience on this technology that you are applying for methane emissions. They seem to be really revolutionary. Can these technologies apply in conducting biodiversity studies, such as mapping fauna and flora degradation?
Yes, some of them in some forms. And we've been looking at issues of forestation or deforestation. And indeed, the ability to certify various measures like afforestation and to measure the impact and to validate claims made by companies that have contributed offsetting factors like afforestation is very important, I think. So yes, it's not we don't focus exclusively on methane. We don't focus exclusively on upstream and midstream emissions. There's a range of things we're looking at, and I think the policy approach has to be comprehensive. A corporate strategic approach has to be comprehensive as well. Nevertheless, some measures will have more impact than others.
Okay, we will get back to this question. I will address it to Vanessa as well. But meanwhile, you were speaking a lot about third-party verification. And it seems to be a very important point. But what do you think if oil and gas businesses were left to their own devices? What sustainability factors would they be measuring and integrating? So do you think that this external pressure is the only way to drive improvements? Or can our oil and gas companies actually develop these metrics on their own and improve their responsibility this way?
Well, I'm a bit of a cynic. I mean, I think things make sense if they commercially make sense, right? Measures have to pay for themselves, and the important thing is to price in the externality. It has to be priced in. So the pricing can come in many different ways. It can be a carbon price. It can be investor pressures. It can be pressure from local communities. Exacting a more responsible behavior to grant companies the license to operate. There are many in our industries that are highly climate conscious, highly responsible, and who share everybody's interest in more sustainable future and preserving a planet that's hospitable for our species. But I think the key is to make it worth economically as well. Ultimately, the executives of the company have the fiduciary responsibility to provide profits to their shareholders. So I think it's very important to be to convert measurements into dollars and cents.
Antoine, one more technical question. What are the permissions that will be required to have this technology that you've described utilized in any oil and gas company?
Well, it's not so much a question of permission. I think it's a question of partnering, of the partnerships between the private sector and the industry, the measurement industry, all the non-governmental organizations that contribute to this effort, and the policymakers. Really, it takes efforts from every sector to improve things. We are partnering with companies that are signing on to our programs and becoming customers. Our focus right now is on letting the companies measure, size up the problems from their operations, and put in place steps to fix what needs to be fixed. We're also sharing some of our data with groups like the International Energy Agency that reported on our methodologies in their methane tracker report that was just updated last month or 2 months ago. So I think it's a multi-pronged effort, and it really takes everybody to contribute. The work that EDF is doing is fantastic. The work from the satellite provider community is very important. It's really the combination of different sectors, different shareholders, and different technologies. We're in our company, we're not technology. We're not rigid in terms of the trust of technology. We're very agnostic. We actually combine different technologies, and we look forward to continuing to do so.
Antoine, one last question before we move to the next speaker. One key methane emission assessment issue that most measurement programs are very time-consuming and very costly to perform. How will you encourage oil and gas companies to have special focus on this and help provide high-quality data?
That's one of the beauties of what we've tried to design, what we've come up with, is that we have an automated process that really scans the entire world on a constant basis. So we have a frequent revisit time. As the world moves on, as technology matures, we have more and more capacity to measure. The frequency will increase, the coverage will increase. So this is by no means the end of the process. This is the beginning of a process. But the point is to make it economical, and to make it feasible, and to make it cost-effective, and to make it high impact. So the measurements, the satellite measurements, have a great value in that they're comprehensive, they're global, and they're quasi-real time. Now, there's other technologies that provide more granularity. For example, measurements from planes, low-altitude planes, can provide much more granularity on certain key assets than we do, and can be used in conjunction with our measurements. But to use these technologies, you usually need to have some ideas of where to look. And the value of satellite imagery is that you don't need to have a preconceived idea of where to look. You can actually detect emissions very often when you didn't suspect them to happen.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Antoine. Meanwhile, I want to encourage our participants, please write down your questions at any time during the live cast. We really need them. We really ask them. And meanwhile, let's move to our next speaker. Actually, we've decided, as the question of artificial intelligence was raised, let's move to Vanessa Miller-Fels, who is part of Microsoft's Cella Environmental Sustainability team and serves as Director of Energy Innovation and Impact. Vanessa, please.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Tatiana, for having me. First, it's an honor to be on this panel, and I'm really humbled to join you and also my esteemed fellow panelists. We've had a fantastic introduction by Pavan and also amazing work done by Antoine and Kairos. This is certainly something we're also very interested in. As Antoine kind of teed it up, there's a lot of data that's being analyzed, and so we see it as an exciting opportunity for a technology company like Microsoft. And I'm particularly excited to join this talk, Gaia Talk, because it's a great name. One of my favorite books about climate change is called Facing Gaia by French philosopher Bruno Latour. So it's a particular honor. So in January, Microsoft launched a carbon initiative, setting new goals for our company to become carbon negative by 2030. And I think I'll touch upon kind of some of the issues we faced and we are facing as we want to kind of first assess the challenge and then address the challenge. So to guide our sustainability journey, we've developed kind of a few principles, and I focus on 3 of the main principles. First principle, and it will echo very much what you've talked about, is put the data and the digital technology to work. And simply stated, what we can't solve a problem that we don't fully understand. Second principle is take responsibility for our carbon footprint. And the third principle is empower others, partners and customers and policymakers around the world to assess and address their own carbon footprint. And we hope to kind of take some of the lessons we are learning from our own kind of exercise in addressing and abating our carbon footprint. You can go to the next slide. So I think there was a good question that was raised earlier with Antoine, is how can we use some of the technology like the one Kairos developed for methane tracking to assess the biodiversity and the kind of the situation for the fauna and flora of the world. And this resonates very well with something an effort we've just kind of undertaken and announced on Earth Day this year, so about a month ago, and what we call the Planetary Computer. This effort of building a planetary computer is really to try to address this question of how do we get better at understanding the problem. This is a computing endeavor, not surprising for Microsoft, but the goal is really to aggregate global environmental data that's collected from a number of sources and to employ machine learning and other techniques, other kind of artificial intelligence techniques, to better understand the challenges faced in the planetary health. We hope that this planetary computer will provide answers not only to Microsoft, but also to our customers, but even more broadly to the scientific community that's about to plan sustainability and how we address sustainability. So what is this planetary computer kind of capable of doing? Kind of what would be a good example? Well, I think what Kairos does could certainly maybe fit in that, but we've been focused, for example, on how machine learning, satellite imagery, user source data around the world and in real time can help us assess, for example, on the ground forest covers, and how that can be used for industrial construction, site surveys, or for forest preservation efforts. So we're really I think this measuring matters is very much at the core of this planetary computer. Assessing the planet's Earth must become a more sustained, integrated practice that allows us to understand exactly what is happening in real time to enable smart decision making. For us, it really is captured in this kind of simple sentence, but it should be as easy for anyone in the world to search the state of the planet as it is to search the internet. And this planetary computer is kind of an ongoing development, and I'll kind of talk also a little bit to its genesis. But I think it really resonates very well with some of the policymakers' effort we've seen, particularly in Europe, but hopefully globally. The EU announced, I think earlier this year, a Mission Earth initiative. And this Mission Earth initiative is to improve disaster response and preparedness. And I think the goal is to bring also together the best scientific and industrial expertise to improve the Earth modeling, kind of building almost a digital model of planet Earth, kind of a digital twin. So we hope we can really partner on building this planetary computer. What's kind of the genesis of the planetary computer? And we can go to the next slide. It's an evolution of a Microsoft program that was called AI for Earth that we launched in 2017. The Microsoft AI for Earth was putting AI technology and machine learning technology into the hands of leading ecologists, conservation technologists, and organizations around the world that are working to protect our planet. We focused on these 4 pillars that are indicated here: agriculture, water, biodiversity, climate change. And under climate change, certainly engagement with the energy industry fits pretty nicely. But I wanted to kind of have maybe an example that anybody can use, and also as we're all working from home and many of us have kids in the background, I thought this example of a company, or not really a company, an NGO we supported, it would be a fun one to share. So we can go to the next slide. It's called Naturalist, and it's a social media platform, and it enables basically people to identify the fauna and the flora that surrounds them, that they see anywhere in the world, and it uses AI to kind of identify the species and improve our understanding of the species. So when you're an amateur kind of iNaturalist user and you discover a new species, you can document it and register it. And so through iNaturalist, we've really discovered kind of undocumented behavior and photographed organism that are previously maybe not even been sketched, or only been sketched like 300 years ago in one of Captain Cook's expedition. We're using AI algorithm to be able to upload the picture, to analyze the picture, and basically map kind of the fauna and flora in a richer and much more granular way. Today, we estimate that there's 10 million species in the world, but only 1.8 million have been discovered, and just 90,000 have been analyzed. So there's plenty of scope for getting involved. And so really, this is the one, you can just put in the hands of yourself and your kids as you're trying to occupy themselves in these COVID-19 days. How does this kind of relate to the energy sector? We can go to the next slide. I think this effort to get and put better data at work is also one of the key enablers of the energy transition. You're all familiar in the energy sector with the 3Ds: decarbonization, decentralization, and digitization. I think this is where we're really interested in how can digitization contribute to not only be an enabler, but potentially be an accelerator of the decarbonization. And again, I'll just turn to the EU. That seems to be sometimes at the forefront of a lot of these issues. But the EU has been really thinking about the link between digitization and decarbonization. And they published a paper earlier this year that kind of really tees up this vision where digital technologies can help Europe reduce more CO2 emissions than it emits. This is really what we're trying to figure out, is how do we build technology that will help ourselves, like address the carbon emissions and other GHG emissions within our four walls or within Microsoft operations, but also address emissions outside of our four walls. And we can go to the next slide. That really kind of talks about how important outside of our four walls and kind of having this conversation with the outside community is important for Microsoft. Because when we announced this we called it a moonshot, carbon negative commitment by 2030. We're one of the few companies to have had a carbon negative commitment. We have had to measure our carbon emission and our other gas emissions. And going back to Pavan and Antoine, we have to figure out the tools and the ways that we can be accountable for these carbon emissions that we're reporting. And initially, we reported Scope 1 and Scope 2. Now we've included Scope 3, which basically relates to our what we call downstream and upstream emissions. So the emissions of the products we sell and the emissions of that comes in from our supply chain. To be able to assess Scope 3 emission is particularly challenging. It's challenging for Microsoft, and it's maybe even more challenging for the oil and gas sector. There's reports that says that the oil and gas sector, Scope 3 accounts for 90% of their emissions. And so being able to create the tools and having that conversation around what are the appropriate tools to measure carbon emissions and other gas emissions is very critical for us, and will continue to be a main focus.
So
And
actually, Vanessa, before moving forward, I have a question which corresponds very well to what you are speaking about. Dakota is asking, what is Microsoft doing internally to create a culture of sustainability within the company? And how could that be transferred to the oil and gas industry?
that's a very good question. I think our employees are very core to our carbon strategy, very much so. In fact, it's one of the 4 pillars when we think about, okay, what are the actions of our operation? And I mentioned the customers and the partners. The employees are one critical pillar. We have a very active worldwide sustainability community that has more than 2,600 active members. And we have kind of an open dialogue with not only this active members, but also the broader employee in terms of how do we engage them and how do we work with them and almost kind of crowdsource some ideas or, benefit from their network to be able to be more successful. I think employees is a critical part of changing your sustainability or building your sustainability vision. And I mean, to be frank, some initiatives have been led by employees and will continue to be led by employees, or letters to shareholders, or so that continue to be part of this ongoing dialogue.
That's a great example for us as well. 2 more questions, if you do not mind. Inna is asking how the data taken and worked out by the satellite measurements could be verified, proved in case the country or the region or the company polluter rejected or claimed invalid. Is there any international mechanism?
So when we're using like a satellite data, and how would if a country or a company doesn't think it's an appropriate data or it's invalid, what would be the mechanism to be able to track it? I think we haven't figured it out yet, to be frank. The idea is any problem as multi-dimension, and the beauty of a planetary computer or any kind of data platform and machine learning platform is that you can integrate and you can ingest much more data and much more dimensions of data than the human mind, than I could be able to process just looking at an Excel spreadsheet. And so that's hopefully with having that multi-dimension aspect, we're able to kind of neutralize better the data points that we don't trust. But this is certainly something that is very core to Microsoft, to build trust on the data and the analysis that data provides. And I mean, I didn't go through kind of some of the principles that we have for AI engagement, for artificial AI engagement, but trust is a critical one, and fairness and a few others. So definitely an ongoing question, I think, for all of us here.
I see. By the way, on AI, is it applicable for empowering smart conservation actions, such as to create habitat maps for endangered species? This is crucial in big oil field development plan and execution that often require massive displacement of organisms from natural habitats. It's a question from Vanessa.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think this is certainly an application that would be very interested in solving with the appropriate partners. I mean, I would imagine we have things like that in our AI for Earth at this point, and I can't point to any specific work right now, but not apply to oil and gas specifically. So I think it would be great to kind of see how we apply it to specific industries and how we enable specific industries to use some of these technologies to help them better site, to help them better manage or rebuild kind of the habitats of the fauna that they otherwise would endanger.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was really very interesting and exciting, I think, for everybody. So let's move forward again, back inside the industrial expertise. And I would happy to give the floor to Poppy Kalezi, Global Energy Director, Environmental Defense Fund. Poppy is also leading EDF's energy program in Europe with a focus on deep reductions in global oil and gas methane emissions by 2025. So Poppy, please.
Thank you very much for organizing this global conversation. It is really, really heartening to see the level of engagement and the access that this community has to global resources and expertise. And it is particularly heartening to see the engagement of operational engineers in really solving the problem. I will be very brief and really reflecting on what we heard today. One thing that becomes clear is that increased transparency enabled by technology is really intensifying demands for disclosure. But that being said, not all data is equal. In the area of methane emissions, particularly, both investors and regulators are really pushing and demand more verifiable data. So as Antoine mentioned before, the Volkswagen case has really woken up regulators, investors, and civil society, especially in jurisdictions like Europe. And where we are now in the conversation is that non-financial data, such as methane emissions, is increasingly financially material for both regulators and investors. Some in the industry have responded by committing to a net zero vision as a core part of their corporate strategy. Most of these announcements have been, of course, met with both support and also some skepticism. So many of the companies who have committed to net zero visions have now learned that even though this is a good step forward, without transparency, it is very far from enough. Members of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, who have made a commitment to achieve 0.25% methane intensity by 2025, are increasingly asked to credibly demonstrate that they're delivering on what they said they would deliver. So roadmaps and strategic commitments are no longer enough. Stakeholders, especially among civil society, regulators, investors, really are needing to see investment in real dollars in concrete projects. And importantly, there is an increasing and more urgent demand for verified emissions performance. This is now the new normal. So verifiable data will be the key differentiator between companies in two respects. The one of them is market performance, and the other one is the license to operate. The latter increasingly includes market access. So this means that two of the industry's main customers, governments and investors, will increasingly be asking your commercial colleagues to provide assurances of your company's ESG performance with the same diligence and transparency as they do for financial data. And your commercial colleagues will be coming to you for this information. Unlike dollars and financial metrics, emissions performance and project spending and execution is not something that a commercial person can readily access on their screen. So this new normal, in terms of internal collaboration, this will require a completely different scale of internal collaboration across disciplines and business areas at a scale never experienced before. And the reason why we believe this will actually happen internally is that it will start to have financial consequences. It will be material. So EU leaders are increasingly basing their decisions on whether to provide financial support to companies hit by the COVID virus, depending on companies' alignment with the European Green Deal framework, which targets climate neutrality by 2050.
Poppy,
So-
may I ask you a question on this trust and verification? It's really a very important issue, but do you think, I mean, at least on the EU scale, should it be one organization which is providing this verification, or should it be a network of certified organizations? How do you think it could be organized?
So I know there are conversations which are now at a fairly advanced stage to establish what will hopefully be a global methane observatory, which will be hosted by UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme. As I know from connecting with startups and industry kind of partners in Europe on a daily basis now, there is a huge interest in developing a market for such verification services. So while the jury is still out, I do think that this organization, whatever that is, which will need to reconcile the top-down and the bottom-up measurements and really verify that what companies report really is true. I think this will require a public-private partnership. And I do think that because emissions is a public good, I do think that a public entity should supervise this organization. But of course, to deliver on its mission, it really does need the engagement and the collaboration with the resources in the industry. So public and private sector will have to work in a way that they never have before.
And Poppy, what do you think when, well, oil and gas sector is quite complicated. We have different segments here. We have upstream, midstream, downstream. So what is a meaningful reporting for the upstream in your mind?
So a meaningful reporting, a very concrete example is again in the collaboration with UNEP, and it is called the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, which has developed a taxonomy of reporting requirements and modalities. I think what is now called the level 5, which is a golden standard of reporting, is really reporting based on measurements. So using emissions factors is no longer enough. And I think the golden standard would be to see companies in the upstream sector, particularly, really measuring their emissions, and then having the satellite data with the bottom-up measurements being reconciled by this global methane observatory to then enable action both at the government and regulator, but also the investor level.
I see. And another question, which is actually quite philosophical, maybe. Even with the methane emissions alone, the industry seems to have a really very good in-depth understanding where to measure, what to measure, how it can be fixed. So how do you think oil and gas industry itself could become master of its measurements?
Well, I think the first step is already done with the Gaia community. It is very much the job for the people working in operations. You see the issue every day, and you are here today. So you are actively trying to learn more about the issue, and you clearly are open to hear different views and different suggestions on how to solve the issue. So I would say some very concrete recommendations would be to follow the Methane Guiding Principles 8 best practices, which is now a complete training program helping people both in operations but also commercial people understand the issue and importantly learn from best practice on how to solve this.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Poppy. So I think Antoine wants to respond to you at the golden standard. Antoine, please unmute.
Sorry, thank you. No, I caught only, unfortunately, the end of Poppy's remarks because I was having connection problems for a while. But I fully support what Poppy was saying about level 5 and the methane guiding principles, and I think this is where the private sector can come in and help contribute measurements and validate measurements independently. But yeah, very much so. It's not just about reporting. It's not just about engineered estimates. It has to be about measurements. And the industry, the private sector, is often developing technologies that benefit from its investments and its activities in other areas. So a lot of what we do at Kairos is empowered, is made possible by the know-how and the algorithms that we've developed in other applications. So there's a convergence of interests and a good synergy here between the NGO area, the public sector, the private sector. All these have to contribute, I think.
Okay, great. Thank you, Poppy. Thank you, Antoine. Actually, we are now moving to the most exciting part, I believe, to the Q&A session. And actually, we've got a really great question, which I love, from Alex. It is directed to all the panelists. Do you hash realities of the pressures on margins and the availability of low-cost hydrocarbons will defer important sustainability initiatives, despite everyone having recently had the time to think about them? So, who is ready to start?
I can go first.
Pavan, yes, go first.
From the outside. So, look, the way I see it is that competition, technology will always change product availability. That's part of business and how it evolves. And so I think that it's nothing new that competition and that technology is already having its impact on the kind of hydrocarbons that are available and alternatives. I mean, after all, if I look back 10 years ago, grid-based electricity used to be priced at something like 35 cents per kilowatt hour. Now it is available at 2 cents per kilowatt hour, and it's available in gigawatt size. So I've personally seen projects of that size, and there are quite a few now. So, in 10 years, how much can change? I think we just need to get used to the fact that the energy sector overall is evolving fast. Within the oil and gas space, it's evolving fast. Outside the oil and gas space, it's evolving even faster. We just need to get used to that. And the other thing I'll say is that, look, the recognition of that and the realities of stranded assets, and call it what you like, basically is already up top of the mind as far as the investors are concerned. So I think the oil and gas sector also has to be agile in recalibrating its expectations over the next few years, and agile in terms of planning its future more as the sort of mainstay of energy rather than necessarily one kind of energy. And you're seeing quite a lot. I mean, the SunPower is 66% owned by Total, right? That's a leading cutting-edge technology solar company, which is owned by a French oil company. So stuff is happening, I think, and I think it'll continue to happen. Just get used to it.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Anybody wants to add on that?
Well, I would say just a couple of things. I would just say companies that do well on the climate do well economically. I mean, there's evidence that good stewards, good environmentally responsible companies perform better. It's good for investment. It's good for the profitability of a company. Second, low carbon prices, low energy prices today make it more difficult to invest. It's a very competitive industry, and there's many concerns. Being good on climate adds to the competitive value of a company, and it makes a stronger case for investment at the time when investment in oil and gas, because of low prices, might be very difficult.
Actually, I think, frankly, that in the current situation of enormous oversupply of hydrocarbons, being it oil or gas, on the consumer side, there could be more decisiveness to go for stricter regulation and stricter requirements on the carbon footprint, on the methane emissions, because the customers can choose now. So I believe, frankly, that it will even reinforce these sustainability requirements, especially as we can see in the European Union, as Vanessa was talking and Poppy was mentioning. We have another question to you, Pavan, actually, from Darcy Spady. He's asking, can you comment on effectiveness of UN SDGs in driving ESG efforts?
It's a very interesting question. Two reasons. One is that I presume everyone is aware of the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, the fact that there are 170 targets and more than 350 indicators. But what the SDGs have done is to provide a policy entry point so that any NGO or any private sector interest group, whether it's renewable energy or whether it's bottom of the pyramid, supply chains, and so on, whatever your focus is, if you want to talk to a government department, whether it's the Commerce Department or an Energy Department or Forestry Department, if you pick the SDG plank on which you're going, the chances are they will have to listen, at least give you a hearing, saying that you are trying to improve the implementation of the global goals for 2030, goal number 6 and 13 and so on. And, this is a proposal that they're... So it's provided a policy entry point. So it's important to focus on that. And secondly, I would say that, everything that I've described to you in terms of measuring impacts, yes, you can measure impacts in terms of capitals, but remember, SDGs 6 for water, 13 for climate, 14 for life on land, 14 for life on underwater, 15 for life on land. These are basically the environmental goals. So impacts on these areas of natural capital will translate into SDG impacts. In the same way, if you look at SDG 1 on poverty and 2 on food security and 3 on health, public health, and so on, again, and so on and so on. These are the social goals, the second tier. And impacts on social capital will affect these goals and vice versa. And then, of course, there are the economic efficiency goals, such as 12 and 11 and 8 and so on. So actually, there's a reasonable connection between the capitals that I've talked about and the SDGs. It's not straightforward, but if you look at it, there's a kind of wedding cake structure where you get some goals which are at the base, the environmental base, and there are the social goals and there are the economic goals. And everything that I've described to you, measuring in 4 capitals, or if you want to measure in 6 capitals, if that you feel innovative, you can also measure in terms of SDG impacts. So when we launched the system that I described to you on World Environment Day on 5th of June, it provides you with an option saying you choose. You can measure capital impacts. You can also go to the premium version, measure in capitals and in SDG terms. It's really looking at the same space from a different lens. And it's important, going back to my first reason, which is that policymakers are focusing on that lens. It has become a kind of convenient, ready reckoner to go and address policy issues with them.
Thank you, Pavan. I have another very interesting question from Abdulaziz, who is saying, I'm going to ask a very layman level question, one that may have asked me. Isn't clean oil and gas an oxymoron? So, Antoine, what do you think? It's really difficult to answer, but...
Listen, of course, there's concerns about oil and gas, but there's also great benefits to it. And every type of energy, including renewable energy, comes with a footprint. So I think the importance is not to ban any particular kind of fuel, is to manage that fuel responsibly. And to do that takes policy measures, takes management measures, but also takes measurements.
Yeah, absolutely.
Completely agree with that. Yeah.
Totally agree with that.
Another question. The industry has a long history of difficulties to align on standards, norms, and so on. How can we accelerate the convergence on shared KPIs measures that can benchmark the oil and gas companies?
Well, I think some of that is happening as we go. I mean, the technology is partly dictating the standards, right? Standards are driving technological research, and we are constantly improving our capacity to measure based on what we need to measure. But seeing things, measuring things that in a way that was not possible before enables us to advance our understanding of the environment, of the climate, of the industry, and to come up with standards and with best practices in a way that was not possible before. So it's an ongoing process, but it's driven partly by technology, partly by policy.
And there is a follow-up question, actually. How do you hold national oil companies in emerging economies accountable on measurement and reporting emissions in the oil and gas industry? For me, it's especially interesting question being in Russia.
Yeah. It may come. I mean, I have a speculation, purely a speculation. So I'm finding that when we look at integrated profit and loss, the approach that we are talking about in GIST and other companies, the most interesting use is actually in the public sector. So two of my clients, Yarra Valley Water, that's Melbourne's water utility, and Sveaskog, that is Sweden's largest forestry company, have actually published their integrated profit and loss. So the platform I'm launching refers to them as leaders and pioneers, and they're both from the public sector. Not only have they done it, but many other companies have done this, more than 50. But two of them have been willing to publish it out there because to them, measuring the impact on public wealth is part of their job. This is part of their purpose, right? So in that sense, I would say that, whether you are Saudi Aramco or whoever it is, part of your purpose is to generate wealth for your society, for your country, right? Provide energy for the world, create wealth for your country. So you should be interested in looking at a holistic picture. So don't only look at the environmental impacts. That's what I keep saying. It's 4 capitals, right? It's 4 capitals. You have to look at all of the other capitals. Look at the economic value added. Look at the human capital value added. Maybe look at the social cost. Maybe look at the environmental costs or benefits, depending on whether you are Antoine's company or whether you are an oil company. So you have to look at all dimensions of capital. And why would a public company, in other words, one that is owned by the government, why would it not be interested to declare its public value, right? What does it add value to in the economy overall? So I would say, paradoxically, if you want to move in that direction, convince another utility, whether it's an energy utility or a water utility or a forestry utility or whatever it is, in that country to go that route, and then maybe a postal service for that matter. We are even talking to a postal service. Convince one other utility to do this, and then talk to the oil utility and say, please, follow suit.
I agree with this. I would just make 2 points very quickly. One is there's good NOCs and bad NOCs, just like there's good IOCs and bad IOCs from an environmental standpoint. They range the gamut. It's a wide range. Second, nobody can be hidden anymore. Everybody's transparent. Everybody's speaking naked. So that's the beauty about satellite imagery. You don't need permission to take measurements. So everybody is transparent, and the oil and gas industry in particular, as other commodities industries, is a global business. So NOCs depend on export revenue, and the importing communities can see what's going on within the NOCs and can make appropriate business decisions, commercial decisions based on that.
Perfect. Thank you, Antoine. Thank you, Pavan. We are actually moving to the end of our conversation. So if you have any concluding points that you want to stress, some takeaways that you've got during this discussion, please do. Antoine?
I think it's a fantastic time. And the fact that a panel like this one, like the very fact that the Gaia community exists, I think is a sign that we're on the cusp of change. So climate is a huge concern for mankind. The countdown is on. We have a very small carbon budget left, but we have now the tools to make things better and to really move the needle. To have big impact on remediation policies and on commercial policies. The oil and gas industry is an industry that we still depend on for energy purposes. The energy density of oil and gas is unparalleled, particularly oil. So there's great benefits to it. It's now possible to develop oil in a much more responsible fashion than was possible in the past when measurements did not exist.
Thank you, Antoine.
And I'll second that. I think having your society of petroleum engineers and your focus on Gaia as a theme, I think that's fantastic. And I think more of these communities need to evolve and be vocal about their interests to move things forward. Measurements are key. There's a lot of confusion and unnecessary confusion. I mean, with the kind of technology that Antoine has showcased and that my own team in India and Switzerland are showcasing, there's clearly no shortage of technology, be it scientific or economic, to be able to measure impacts. Let's do it. Let's recognize that is the way forward.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Pavan. There is definitely this establishing appetite for more. The winds are changing, and we are starting to talk about meaningful metrics. We are starting to talk about meaningful actions. And more importantly, we start to act. And I am absolutely convinced that we need to work all together from inside the industry, from outside stakeholders. There is no this distinction between different stakeholders. It's our Earth. We are all actually facing these global problems. And I hope that this talk today was just the beginning of very big and successful journey. So please thank together with me all our panel participants. I think it was extremely interesting and useful. And please join us at the next Gaia talk, where we will focus on methane emissions in collaboration with OGCI, IOGP, and IPCA. So it will take place on June 18th. We are very much looking forward to seeing you all in. And thank you so much for your time, for staying with us, for writing your questions and remarks. I think it is creating this spirit of joint effort, and together I'm sure we can solve any problem. Thank you so much. And maybe Johanna, if you would like to join us and to say farewell words to our participants.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, Antoine, Pavan. You were absolutely fantastic. I'm seeing lots and lots of comments coming in, and I really like the word hope. I like the word community, and I really like the word working together. It's our planet. It's one planet. All this polarization has to stop. We have to work together. Thank you for our wonderful speakers. Tatiana, for your fabulous job as moderator. Thank you so much. See you all very soon.
Bye-bye. See you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.